I'm out here on a recent harvest area. It was harvested about 5 years ago or so, and I just kind of want to point out we're at the landing here. You can obviously see there's the pile, and you can see it's been planted. There are trees, Douglas fir back there, and they did plant in here as much as they could. However, it's tough to plant where you don't have too many plantable spots. That's why there's not too many trees in here. However, the thing I want to point out is that, you know, the growth of the trees that did get planted in this area are stunted, and then kind of talk a little bit about that. Mostly you can see there's a few Douglas fir down here by my truck mixed in with the alder that are doing really well because they've got help from the cyanobacteria that live on the root nodules and share nutrients with them. But you know, these Douglas fir down here were planted at the same time that these Douglas fir back here were planted. And so what's happening here that I want to point out is there's been compaction because this was the landing area. And then not only do we have compaction, you know, changing the structure of the soil, especially the A horizon, you know, and messing with the equilibrium of the organisms that are living in there. But we've also got all this bark here, which is mostly all carbon. Very little nitrogen in it. So some of the nitrogen that was on the needles of the branches up there was good, and it's going into the soil profile eventually, but it takes a lot longer to break down bark and non-nitrogen containing organic matter, like the bole of a tree, the bark. That's all 99% carbon. And so if you put too much carbon into the soil at one time, then it will take a lot longer to break down because it takes a certain type of organism to break that down. And then so what you end up having is an issue with too much carbon in your soil, and then the microorganisms in there that changing into ones that will only break down that carbon, and there's not enough nitrogen and other nutrients for other organisms that like to break down those nutrients. And so it slows down basically the decomposition rate of the organic matter on top of the soil. So if we can come in here with, you know, some organic matter, some compost, fluff this area up, we might be able to increase the growth of these trees here. And you can even see we've got enough water in this area. You can see the grass, and we've got horsetail coming up here, and still this little Douglas fir is just struggling. He's got enough sun, but you know, it's just basically the combination of too much carbon in the O horizon here, because it's bark and boles of trees and pieces of tree and branches. All the needles have fallen off and have been cycled already probably into the soil. And then the compaction, because this was a highly used area where they were loading trucks and obviously processing logs. So that's the story I wanted to tell here. All right, real quick here, just want to show you another example of the impacts of logging, and particularly landings, on compaction and tree growth. This is a sale that was cut about 6 years ago, or yeah, about 5 or 6 years ago. And so the trees are about 5 years old. It was cut about 6 years ago. And this is the landing. It was a pretty huge landing area. They pretty much pulled all the timber from up there down to this area here. It's about a 20-acre unit, and this was the main landing. And you can see the Douglas fir in here is very chlorotic, which means it's got yellowing of the needles. And you can see also the substrate is very rocky. So, you know, a lot of macropores that can easily be turned into micropores, which will kind of exacerbate compaction in a lot of ways, removing the space, airspace, and water space, so exacerbating compaction. You also have a lot of the bark material that sloughs off during the processing of the timber. And so all around me here basically are trees that are less than 6 feet tall. Most of them are around 2 feet tall. You can see how the growth has been impacted here, because if I walk into the unit a little more, suddenly we're into trees like this one, which, you know, is 8 feet tall or more. And these aren't naturally regenerated trees. You can tell they were planted. We do have some of the natural regen coming in here, but even it is chlorotic and not doing very well, because we've lost most of the all the O horizon here, pretty much most of it, and it's turned into O horizon that is difficult to break down because it's all carbon. And you know, it's very rocky soils, so there's not a lot to break down here to create a nice A horizon, which these trees really need, you know, to get going. And the further we walk into the stand, you can see this guy's even over here is coned out from stress probably. But, you know, for the most part, the trees, once we get back in there, are 8 to 10 feet tall, whereas the trees here around this landing are obviously suffering and only 3 or 4 feet tall. So you can also see here, while I try and dig in my shovel, it doesn't want to go very far. It hits kind of a pan. It's not even, you know, it's definitely kind of rocky, very rocky material, but, you know, it's somewhat of a compacted layer. You know, if I walk to an area that wasn't in the landing over here, that didn't have much landing activity in it, let's say, and I want to put my shovel in, it's very similar. Ow. It's just a rocky area altogether. But and we're by a stump here. But my point is, if you get it further into the unit, you get into areas, you know, like this, let's say, that are less compacted. And here's a good example of the impact of a landing area on compaction and tree growth.